The U.S. announcing new sanctions against Russia this weekend, cutting off Kremlin-controlled media outlets from using American advertising. The sanctions also included new export controls in the industrial sector. Joining us to discuss the situation in Russia further, as well as the impact on the economy, as well as the U.S. economy, is Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Wally Adeyemo. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Deputy Secretary. I do want to start more on the U.S. economy. We will get to the sanctions in just a moment, but given what we are seeing in the markets and what we have been talking about here on the program on a regular basis, and of course watching the Federal Reserve pull away some stimulus, I'm wondering how you inside of Treasury are thinking about stimulus and whether you have some tools you can deploy on the inflation front as well.
Well, as you stated and you started with, the key responsibility for dealing with this is the Federal Reserve, and they're doing exactly what they need to do, which is dealing with high prices in the economy. But you're right that the president is increasingly focused on what we can do to lower costs for the American people. That's why he released a historic amount of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. In addition to doing that, we're focused on lowering other costs for Americans as well. Last week, we announced that over $11 billion was being used from the American Rescue Plan to help invest in affordable housing to bring down shelter costs. We're doing everything we can to use those resources to also bring more people back into the labor market. And then finally, we're also focused on ensuring that we deal with the challenges that we face in the supply chain, because the president knows the most important thing we can do right now for the American people is lower costs. But Julie, the thing I would say is that the high prices we're facing in our economy are being faced around the world because of COVID, but also because of Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, which is leading to higher energy costs and higher food costs.
Mr. Secretary, what do you think the impact is right now of inflation on lower income households in the United States?
We all know that high costs have a disproportionate impact on those people who earn the least money. That's why the president's focused on doing everything we can to address that challenge. I mentioned what we've done in terms of releasing oil into the market to bring down the cost of gas. But we're also today talking about the idea of lowering the cost of broadband in order to make sure that low-income and moderate-income Americans have access to the technology that's critical to the economy today. And we're going to continue to find ways to lower costs in the economy.
You also had the unique position of serving as the first chief of staff for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and that was during the financial crisis. And so when you compare that to the crisis as of right now, consumer protections against kind of price gouging and any of those actions that would be coming from companies that aren't even directly experiencing some of the impacts that you mentioned a moment ago. You know, what have those steps been like, and how are you monitoring effectively to ensure that there are those consumer protections even during this time?
One thing that we all have to be grateful for is that we have a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was created, you're right, during the last crisis. And because of that, American consumers are better protected against the kinds of abuses that occurred during the last crisis. The truth is that we're better positioned today because of the policy choices that we've made during the pandemic, like passing the American Rescue Plan, like getting Americans vaccinated, than any other country to deal with the challenges that we face throughout the economy, not just here in America, but around the world. The goal now is to make sure that we both protect consumers from abuse, but also provide them with the resources they need to make it through the end of the pandemic and also to deal with these high costs. That's exactly what the president and the administration is focused on.
So let's get back to those high costs and the high cost for energy in particular for just a moment, and what you've been working on in terms of these Russia sanctions. Of course, you're working in concert with the European Union, which is still pretty dependent on Russia for its energy resources, but they are putting together a package to try to change that. And some of what came out over the weekend, for example, is there's no more proposed ban on EU vessels transporting Russian oil to third countries outside of the EU. But there is a ban on insuring those vessels. When you look at the package they've coming up with, do you think it is strong enough in order to further cut off Russia?
You mentioned this in the beginning. And the truth is that Europe is far more dependent on oil from Russia than the United States is. That's because in the United States, we're a net energy producer because of the choices we've made here. And one of the things we're committed to doing is helping to provide energy to Europe. The president was there a few weeks ago, and he made a commitment to ensuring that we would provide them with liquid natural gas from the United States. And what we know is that Europe is going to do everything they can as quickly as possible to end their dependence on energy in energy from Russia. A few weeks ago, they took the step of ending their dependence on coal. We expect in the coming days they'll make an announcement with regard to what they're going to do with oil. I'm not going to get ahead of what they're going to announce, but what I would say is that throughout Russia's invasion in Ukraine, the United States, Europe, and our allies around the world have taken steps to reduce the resources to Russia in order to make sure that they have less resources to fight their war on Ukraine. That's exactly what we expect Europe to do with our help and as part of our alliance.
And at the same time, when it comes to increasing the flow of oil here in the United States, we're sort of in this awkward transition period, aren't we, Mr. Deputy Secretary, in terms of trying to transition to a so-called clean energy future at the same time that we find ourselves still dependent on oil. And so the administration has asked oil companies to drill more. How do you sort of balance that line right now? And how long is the administration going to have to do this, given that we do see oil prices continue to go higher?
So you're right that we're in the middle of a transition. And it's not just a transition here in the United States, but it's a global transition. And it's one the president's been very clear about. The reason we released the oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was because we knew that we needed to reduce costs for American consumers and consumers around the world. And the reason we're calling on companies to produce more energy is because we want to keep costs low as we work through this transition. But it's always important for us to remember why the transition is important, because we know that climate change is not only a threat to our way of life, it's a threat to our economy. But in addition to climate change, the thing that we know looking at what's happening now is that we don't want to remain dependent on oil from Russia or from any other country. That's why we need to move to a clean energy transition as quickly as possible. And we can do both things at the same time. Invest now in producing more energy to supply our economy, but at the same time, make critical investments in our economy that allow us to be a leader in the clean energy transition as well.
Deputy Secretary, the energy sanctions have led to economic disruption in Russia, but it has not kind of sparked any type of turnaround from Russian military forces and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Are there any non-energy sanctions that the White House is considering right now?
So I think I want to make it clear that we haven't directly sanctioned energy. What we've actually done is in each one of our sanctions, we've created exemptions so that energy can continue to flow. The president's direction to us has been take every step we can to impact Russia's economy while limiting the impact on our own. So in addition to the sanctions we've placed on Russia's financial system, we're also looking at sanctions we can place on Russia's military industrialized complex. Because of the export controls we've already put in place, Russia's top two manufacturers of tanks are no longer in business. And when you think about what's happened in Ukraine because of the resources we provided to the Ukrainian people and the bravery of the Ukrainians on the battlefield, Russia today has far fewer tanks than they had going into this invasion, and they can't make more because of the actions that we're taking with sanctions. And our goal is going to be to continue to take actions that will degrade Russia's military industrialized complex in order to make sure that they can't not only fight the war in Ukraine, but also so they can't project power into the future. But ultimately, the thing we have to remember is the reason that energy prices are higher, the reason food prices are higher, are because Russia is taking actions like blocking the ports in Ukraine so food can't get out. So until Russia ends this invasion, we're going to have to deal with these high costs. And what the president has asked us to do is take every step we can to bring costs down for the American people, while also ensuring that the Russian invasion of Ukraine ends.
Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Wally Adeyemo, thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.